everybody. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you today on WJOPLP Newburyport at FM 96.3 on Channel 9 and on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel at ncmhub.org. I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm so happy this morning to welcome John Burciaga and Elizabeth Rose here. They're going to talk to us about the Poetry in Public Places project. John Burciaga has been a resident of Newburyport for nearly 20 years. He has had several incarnations, he tells me, as clergy, journalist, and poet that have taken him to live throughout the United States. But he's a native of Missouri and educated there through his university and grad degrees. He's also done further graduate study at the University of Chicago. He's done poetry readings in local and regional venues and is currently pursuing the project he's here to teach us about today, Poetry in Public Places. His own poetry encompasses a multitude of subjects and themes, including science, through which he hopes to popularize the field and increase public understanding of it, which it strikes me as a pretty important endeavor these days. Other of his themes are nature, love, the pandemic, family and friendship, and introductions to classical poetry and poets. John, you're clearly a Renaissance person. Welcome to the morning show, and thank you for taking time to be here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here, Mary.
My pleasure. We're also fortunate to have Elizabeth Rose here. Elizabeth is a LICSW. She's a psychotherapist, community activist, and a writer. She's had her poetry published in the literary magazines Verdad and Barbar. She's also published essays and opinion pieces in the Boston Globe, the New Mexico Review, the Worcester Journal, the Anti-Heroine Chic, and Escape, a collection of memoir pieces published by the Pathfinders Collective. She received her MFA in creative nonfiction from Lesley University in 2019, and she's best known locally for founding the yearly Rubbish to Runway refashion show, which I hope to learn a little bit more about later in the show. She's currently enrolled to become a certified poetry therapist, which we're also going to talk about later today. So Elizabeth, welcome, and thank you so much too for taking time to be here.
Thank you, Mary. I'm excited.
Well, John, let's start with you. Tell us, please, about the mission of the Poetry in Public Places project and how you became engaged with this endeavor.
Well, to me, poetry is another kind of sacred scripture. And you don't just ask people to come someplace and do it. I feel the same way about religion. I don't think you should be asked to come to church. The church should be going out into the world.
Interesting.
So it's the same way with poetry. You ask people to come someplace, they've got to, in this busy world and busy time, they've got to get up, get ready. They got to choose between that and so many other things to do. This way, they go out someplace, they go to restaurants, they go to businesses, and there's the poetry. They can't help but see it. And so that's one of the ways that I am trying to get poetry more into the public forum.
Well, John, that strikes me as brilliant. And I really like your analogy to how religion could and perhaps should reach out to people and give them a reason to explore it and to value it in a different way. So, well, John, can you give us some examples of the public places in our community where you've placed poems?
Yes. The first time the breakthrough was with the New Kitchen on Pleasant Street.
Yes, familiar with it.
Joshua Van Dyke, who's the owner of that, and several others that are around the region. And he was willing to let me put up for National Poetry Month, the month of April. He has a large restaurant. All ages go there. It's really what I call a happening place.
Yeah.
I was able to put up 15 of the kinds of poetry that I have there on 2 foot by 3 foot poster board. And so they were there for an entire month. After that, I was at the coffee shop on State Street. I had, I think, 10 of them up at that time. Later, I'll be having some up at the firehouse on the upper level, and then also have a wonderful program coming up at the senior center, which is going to be called Poetry and Pizza. Food for body and soul.
Now that's a lure.
Yes, a lure. But you know what? Already people have responded to Mary Kelly, who's the activities director. They want to be part of it. These pizza places,
Oh.
virtually every pizza place in the area has offered to host one of those things in terms of bringing the pizza for the people. So we'll be talking about poetry, reading poetry, and after that, then we'll have pizza, not before.
Well, you know, poetry and pizza, you can't go wrong.
No.
Can't
you
go
can't go
wrong.
wrong.
Can't go wrong. It's an attraction.
Another brilliant idea.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious to find out, John, so what do you hear back, both from the organizations or businesses that have sponsored the poetry in public places, and also their customers or people just passing through or by? What have you
Yeah.
heard in response to
Well, when I was at New Kitchen, I would go in very frequently. I'd go in twice a day. And I'd see people looking at them, and then when they realized that I was the poet, they wanted to talk with me. And especially young people. I was so glad because they're young teens. There are gaggles of young boys and girls who come in there as well. And they love the epigrams from the ancient Greek. And one of them they liked was, it said, once boy crazy, she's now crazy for girls. Has traded her toys from his to hers. Who should care? Whose business is it? Now, this was said back in ancient times, and that's the kind of controversy we're having today. Whose business is it? You know,
Right.
whom someone chooses to love
Right.
or wants to love. So that would strike up conversations.
I'll
And
bet.
one time, a group of boys stopped me outside on the street and said, "Are you the one who's got the poetry in there?" And they were taken with the science ones, the ones on thermodynamics, their young interest in science. So that was terrific to have that little conversation
Oh, I'll bet.
outdoors. So I couldn't have had that by asking them anonymously to please come and hear me read some poetry. So
Well, that's proof positive of what you began talking about, which is you need to take poetry to people. And when you do take poetry to people and they find something they like, and I think that's a critical part of it, people being drawn to poetry they feel a personal connection to, rather than something they're taught in school and they're suggested you must read this and like this. So you take to people something that they discover, and then they find they're intrigued by it or they like it in your home, aren't you?
well, you're spot on. I'm going to use that sometime. No, thank you for
Yeah.
that. That's well said.
Well, John, would you like to share one of your poems with us?
Yes, you know what? One thing is that I don't want to be morbid about it, but we all know that thing. But do not go gently into that dark night.
Famously, Dylan
Some
Thomas.
poetry about death is very dark. And I don't mean to do that at all. Let me see if I can catch up with that very quickly. I found out that after, as old as I am now, when you think about death, from being a young person, you don't know what to think about it. Well, quite frankly, I don't know what to think about it now either. But we all do. And, Freud said we all know we're going to die, but nobody believes it. And so I wrote one that was called "Can I Die Now?"
Oh,
Can
what
I
an
die
interesting
now?
title.
Can I
Okay.
die now? I'm not the kind. Time's a factor here, and though I'm always quite on time, exactly what's the time to live or die? Living time has much to do with early, late, or right on time. Death has only one, and always on its time. So, time's the thing here, and though I'm always quite on time, I must say that regarding death, I'm not the kind, and I really haven't got the time.
Oh, John. Yeah, well done.
I love that one.
Let me just add one more. I have
Yeah.
a very short one over there on one of the boards, and it's actually the body of the poem has the same meter as the title.
Okay.
And so it's Divinities of the Coming Spring. And if there be gods, they must be wildflowers. I love the wildflowers in Vermont. One of my favorite things in the springtime. So that's one of my shortest, actually my shortest and one of my favorite poems.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, excellent. Oh, thank you so much, John. I really
Thank you for letting me
appreciate
share.
that. Thank you for
great.
sharing. I really
wonderful.
enjoyed both of those very much. Well, one of I know that your endeavors, and you're committed to discovering and supporting emerging poets within the community,
Yes.
which is how you found Elizabeth. So please tell us about how did you find Elizabeth?
I heard her at a public reading locally called First Friday, and she was with a group of people whom I think that she organized. She can tell you about that. But I heard her read, and I thought, I'd like to have her come along for this today. And so thank you for inviting her as well to this.
Absolutely.
And I'll let her tell you about
All
that.
right. Okay. Yeah, Elizabeth, I'm curious to find out what drew you to writing poetry. If I don't know if you've been doing it when you started, if you've been doing it all your life. Were there poems that inspired you to begin, or did you just always write?
I kind of always wrote since I probably was in the fourth grade, and my fourth grade teacher said to my mom, she's a writer.
Oh, no kidding.
yeah,
Okay, she
so
had a
that was-
vision.
that was a big moment. But I think I really got serious about poetry during COVID. I always kind of thought that poetry was like my jam. It was like something
Yeah.
I would go to, like just kind of for fun. When I was tired of writing big, long, complicated essays where I would have to be following all kinds of ideas and being logical and blah, blah, blah. So, but poetry was just like candy. You know, it was just something I wanted to, just pick it up.
Clearly,
and
you were
do it.
naturally drawn to it.
Yeah, just naturally drawn to
Yeah.
like the brevity of it. Mm-hmm. That's what I really, really love.
Brevity is beautiful, I think.
Yeah. And I always say, like, well, I guess I'm a poet. I'm short and to the point because I can be very pointed.
Yeah.
Also, in my talking with people, I don't beat around the bush a lot. So
Okay.
I think I was drawn to that.
So it was
that
also a
aspect.
natural expression
It was
of who you are.
very natural expression of
Yeah.
myself.
Well, with that as introduction,
Yeah.
would you share a poem with us, please?
Sure. So this one is funny because mine is called Death.
It's our theme.
We didn't plan that, but we're of similar age, and I think that when you get to be this age, you do spend
You
a
think
lot of
about
time.
it a lot.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
this was
absolutely.
a poem. Like I think the thing about this poem was that. During COVID, I was very obsessed with death, and I was working out kind of like, what would death be like, and would I be able to handle it, and just all the visions of all the people dying in the hospitals without their loved ones there. It was just such an awful vision of death.
Yeah.
And so I think I spent a lot of time kind of worrying about it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I finally just got myself to a point where I wrote this poem about death.
All right, please share.
So it's called Death. When death arrives, I'll eagerly unbolt my senses from the earth, calling myself a spiritual being, departing a useless body. Bidding goodbye to the earth will be easy, effortless. Perhaps death will arrive on a June day, when the trees are fully dressed and the phoebe utters its name in the lilac bush. Perhaps death will arrive in November, when the red and pink sunset announces beyond newly bared bones of trees. There's nothing to miss if I have years piled on, and I've seen it many times. Perhaps death will arrive in December, when the pond lays frozen flat. It'll be nothing to die in a night when the pond's tectonic ice plates moan like haunted whales. I'll be awake anyway, imagining all the fish banging their heads on their frozen ceiling, wishing to fly up to join the blazing stars. If I'm honest, spring would be my preferred time to die. It's so average, predictable, with the bursting forth of the fuzzy maple flowers hanging down like tassels on my grandmother's lampshade, and all the people exclaiming, "It's spring!" and running outside, forgetting their raincoats. Or what if it was today, the one of lattice shadows, like my wedding dress, the one with the ripe summer breeze of mown grass spreading like summer uncorked, the one with the white dog chewing at my feet.
Oh, Elizabeth, thank you for that. That's lovely, beautiful.
Well, and this is why I wanted her to be part of this.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah,
That
thank
was
you so much
terrific.
for that. That's really a beautiful poem and evocative. because I love the way you position death in the different seasons, but you also connect it to,
Right.
as I think thinking about death does, it kind of brings us to think about the world we live in
It
in a way we
does.
often take for granted or simply don't pay
does.
attention
That's
to.
right.
So thinking about the end of our senses
Yes.
makes you think about all the sensory experiences
Yes.
that are there in the world. Makes you kind of want to wake up and pay attention to them now.
Yes, that's right.
I'm sure you had that in mind.
I don't know what I had in mind. I just was like,
And I love but well, everybody's response
Yes,
is
that's
different,
right.
but that's what it brings for me, and
Yes.
I love the dog at the
No,
end.
she's good. She's good, Elizabeth.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you brought that one. I really enjoyed it. Thanks, Elizabeth. Well, you mentioned in your bio, which I
Yeah.
read earlier, that you're in the process of being certified to become a poetry therapist,
Yeah.
which is so intriguing for me.
Yeah.
Please tell us what you've observed, because I know you're a therapist as
Yeah.
well as all the other things you do.
Yeah.
And what have you observed about the healing impacts of poetry and how poetry therapy works?
Yeah. So I just think we just had an experience of how poetry works.
Yes, we did.
With John's poem, where he gives us the idea that, no, death, you can wait. Take it at my time. It's not
Yeah.
on your time. So the fact of that out of control feeling.
Mm-hmm.
So if this was a poetry therapy session and we used his poem, we would everyone in the room would talk about, what is it like to feel out of control, and
Yeah.
what other places do you feel out of control,
Yeah.
and what about how out of control you feel about death, which is probably one of the most terrifying parts of death, is that it's going to choose us.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. And we don't, we try to manage our lives so that we have control.
Yeah.
That's what we're always trying to do with all of our mechanisms and our technology and our seatbelts and our following the laws and everything. And so that's one thing about death. It just we don't have control
Yeah.
over it. So that would be a perfect example of how poetry could be used in a therapeutic way.
Yeah.
And another way it can also be used, like I just had a client who was grieving the loss of his wife. That's why we were doing sessions together, and I had encouraged him. This is a very common kind of thing. Prescription in poetry therapy would be to maybe write a letter to somebody, so
Yeah.
you give that assignment to go home. And so I had assigned him to go home and to write to his wife, and we met for over 6 months, and he was never able. He was a writer. He wrote to all kinds of people. He even wrote to me, but he couldn't bring himself to write that letter to his wife. And
Yeah.
in our final session, he was able to do that, and it was such a breakthrough for him.
Yeah.
And it was at that point that he began to hear his wife's voice.
Oh.
Finally, after a year of grieving, I know.
That's touching.
It's very touching.
Yeah.
It was so touching. So that's an example of like a way that you can use poetry, or that you can even use a prescription of like what they call bibliotherapy, which
Yes.
would be using letter writing
Yeah.
or something like that.
So it could either take place within a group
Yes.
context where people share
Yes.
the reading of a poem and then share the responses to it, which is
Yes.
kind of a unifying
Yes.
kind of experience, as well as being expressive.
Right.
But it could also be individual.
Yes.
So somebody with your knowledge of sort of the canon of poetry
Yes.
could also think of something that might elicit the emotions, or give an assignment like, well, try writing this letter.
Exactly.
And that worked, didn't it? It took
Yes.
time, but it sounds as though, if I'm understanding you, the impact it has when it finally enabled this person
Yes.
to actually release some of the grief that was stored up and defined in an eloquent way,
Yes.
releasing it.
Yes.
And reconnected him, really,
Yes.
with the person that he lost. So
Yes.
it's powerful.
Yes.
Great.
You got
Wow.
it.
Thank you.
Perfect. She is good.
We
Interesting.
need to take her with us.
She is good. She's a
We need to take
natural.
her with us.
Oh, shucks. Thank you. Well, Elizabeth, I did want to ask you,
Yeah.
also in the bio, I mentioned the Rubbish to Runway Refashion Show.
Yeah.
And I'm really hoping, such an intriguing name.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit, at least,
Yeah.
about that project?
Yeah, so that started in 2010, and it was done to raise funds for an organization that I was very involved with called Long Way Home, which it's an organization located in Guatemala, which is building with rubbish, basically, with recycled materials like cans and trash-filled bottles and earth-filled tires to make a school, to make a campus.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And so there's 17 now. I think there's 22 buildings on the campus now. But anyway, we started this show, the Rubbish to Runway, and artists and designers and just normal people make clothing out of used products. And it could be something like, well, okay, so here's an example that I made. This is from my husband's ties.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so it's yes.
It's very colorful.
It's
and-
very colorful.
It is.
and it
Yeah.
I would never have
And you can
guessed.
see the ends of the ties
Yeah,
then.
yeah.
But I wouldn't have known that if you had told me.
Right. So it looks like a normal scarf, but then if you get in conversation with people, you can say, "Well, this was my husband's ties," and
Absolutely.
There you go.
yeah. So
That's great.
So we've been doing it for 13 years now.
Wonderful.
We have a yearly show, and here's one. I brought some dresses to
Oh
show
my,
people.
that's
So
beautiful.
this was made out of old children's books that were cut
Wow.
up. And made a flapper style kind of
Yes,
dress.
absolutely.
And this was made by a young woman. Well, she's not young anymore, but she was young then. She went to a local, I don't know, like a Kinko's, and they had lots of extra paper
Yeah.
that they were going to
So
throw
that's folded
away.
paper.
And so she folded all these papers.
Oh, it's beautiful.
And she made this beautiful, beautiful dress. And I'll just show you this last one. So this is made out of coffee cup holds.
Oh, my
what
gosh.
you use to make coffee. Yeah. So people come in with all kinds of different things, and here's an example of the building, the Long Way Home. So
Wow.
this is a classroom of the
Oh my
school.
goodness.
And all these are bottles which have been fashioned into the window where the teacher stands in front of. So it's a
Well, it looks like a stained glass window,
Doesn't
and
it?
it's
Yeah,
a
it
much
does.
more attractive classroom than any
It
I
is.
ever had, and that's
Isn't
got to
it?
help induce learning.
I know, and it
That's
is
great.
a stained glass window. That's literally what it is.
Yeah, that is beautiful. Yeah, and so you have a fashion show. What
Every
time of
year.
year does that?
So
usually take place?
next year it's going to be in June. We already have the date. I
Great.
think it's June 21st and 22nd. It is.
Okay.
It's a Friday and Saturday night. It'll be at VZ Memorial Park
Okay.
in Groveland. And
Excellent.
all the funds
Oh,
now
Groveland.
go to support VZ. There are new sponsors.
Oh, that's great.
Not Long Way Home anymore. I'm not on that board anymore. So
Okay.
we're giving the money to a local cause.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth, for the work you do with such an impactful and creative organization, and thanks for telling us about it.
My pleasure.
So, well, I also wanted to ask you each, we all have favorite poems and poems that we feel transform us in some way, either by releasing an emotion or giving us an insight, or sometimes putting into words something that we've known or felt but couldn't quite articulate ourselves. And I was hoping that we could close our interview today with each of you perhaps sharing the story of a poem that you found transformative, and then share the poem with us. And it can certainly be one of your own, because sometimes writing releases those impacts. So would you be willing to share yet again?
Yeah.
Sure. Well, I've been thinking a lot lately. President Biden just recently made a proclamation regarding Emmett Till,
Yes.
the young man who was killed
Yeah.
savagely
Brutally.
back in
Yeah.
1958. And his mother, his name is Mamie.
Yeah.
She's Mamie, can't think what her last name is, Mamie something Till.
Yes.
And I wrote a poem about her called Modern Madonna.
Oh.
And you have to keep in mind Michelangelo's Pietà.
Yes. Yes.
which, interestingly enough, the young Mary, as she would have been when she was a young girl having this baby, but she has this grown
The
child
adult
in her
child,
lap.
right,
So this
yeah.
is interesting.
Yeah.
But anyhow, it's called Modern Madonna. Mamie, like Mary, you were chosen to bear a child of hope and to lose him to inhumanity. In this world between your grief and hers is nothing to be learned but that this again could happen. Holy Mary as a youth holds the man, fully grown upon her everlasting lap, always her dear and helpless child, always vulnerable to wicked men. You're Emmett, Mamie, so young to be far from home and from mother's love. The last he knew were man-monsters who savaged him alive and savaged him in death. They, like Herod, fearful of a child. The sculptor lay Mary's child upon her arms, but none there were for Emmett, whose mother Madonna cried out, like Rachel in the wilderness in her grief, because her children were no more. Mamie Madonna made us look upon his face to see what was done to his childhood and his future, and to his suffering mother. Mary's child lay now forever on the cold, marbled lap of love that he can never feel. Mamie's son, lifted from the unholy water of tortured death, now raised forever on the cross of the violence that killed him. This mother, this modern Madonna, her lap as bare as her womb and her heart. O pietà, 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 pity us that we cannot rid our world of this.
John, thank you. What a powerful poem, and sadly all too timely these days. So, gosh, thank you so much for that. And that was just brilliant to juxtapose Michelangelo Pietà with Emmett and Mamie Till. It brings new levels of sorrow and grief and a kind of a universal meaning to it. So thank you. That's really an amazing poem.
He was pulled from the Tallahatchie River, and you know, there's another song we know so well about Billy Joe McAllister.
Yeah, Billy Joe McAllister.
And so forth, but
Yeah.
that was a real tragedy there.
Yeah.
Was what happened
Absolutely.
to young
Yeah.
Emmett. So
I just wanted to make one comment
yeah.
about your poem, is that because of all of the vast careers you've had in your life, you were able to pull, you were able to see, because of your experience as a clergyman, you're able to see that relationship,
All those incarnations.
all those incarnations.
Yeah.
And so that's just something I so appreciate about poets, is that they're not just studying poetry their whole life. They've had a life, you know, they're doing other things. Rarely does a person make enough money from being a
Right.
poet.
Yeah.
So they're doing other things. They're bringing
Right.
in all of that life
All that
experience and
experience and the
everything that
wisdom.
they have learned and known and tried.
Yeah.
And
well, thank you for saying
Yeah.
that. That's,
yeah,
that's
because I couldn't write that
important.
poem. Because I don't have that knowledge. But you can write that poem, and
And
that's
thank
what's so
goodness
great.
you did. And shared
And you
it with
did.
us. Thank you, John.
I just finished a poem on nuclear power as well.
Oh,
So I do a lot of the gun violence and those
Yeah.
kinds
Yeah.
of things, but I don't want to take up any more time because you may have something else you want to say here.
Yeah, another time.
Oh, yes, it'd be
To come
wonderful
back.
to have you come back. We'd like to come back and update you on our
There you go.
projects here.
Yeah, how about you, Lisbeth?
So I picked this poem by Naomi Shahibnai, who's a very famous poem.
Yeah, I've heard of her.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I saw her speak at a poetry therapy conference, and she actually spoke about this poem.
Oh.
It's called Kindness. Before you know what kindness really is, you must lose things. Feel the future dissolve in a moment, like salt in a weakened broth. What you held in your hand, what you counted and carefully saved, all this must go so you know how desolate the landscape can be between the regions of kindness. How you ride and ride, thinking the bus will never stop. The passengers eating maize and chicken will stare out the window forever. Before you learn the tender gravity of kindness, you must travel where the Indian in a white poncho lies dead by the side of the road. You must see how this could be you, how he too was someone who journeyed through the night with plans and the simple breath that kept him alive. Before you know kindness as the deepest thing inside, you must know sorrow as the other deepest thing. You must wake up with sorrow. You must speak it till your voice catches the thread of all sorrows, and you see the size of the cloth. Then it is only kindness that makes sense anymore. Only kindness that ties your shoes and sends you out into the day to gaze at bread. Only kindness that raises its head from the crowd of the world to say, "It is I you have been looking for," and then goes with you everywhere, like a shadow or a friend.
Oh, that's beautiful, Elizabeth.
See, this is why poetry is sacred scripture
Yeah,
to me.
absolutely.
It's another kind of sacred scripture.
Yes.
That's wonderful.
Well, I love the way the poet, she juxtaposes the suffering
Yes.
that we all experience and observe,
Yes.
and then that kindness is the redemption.
Yes.
It's the salvation.
Yes.
Makes you think about the Dalai Lama has famously said that his religion is kindness.
Yes.
So
That's
anyway, oh my gosh,
That's
I'm
right.
so glad I asked both of you that question.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, we're just about out of time for today, but John, how can people learn more about poetry in public places? Or I was going to ask you where in the community. It sounds they could find some of
Yeah.
your posters, but
They
they're
don't
coming
have
up
to.
here at the Senior Center.
They don't have to. I'm taking it to them.
Yeah,
in
that's
public
right.
Places. And so I will be at the firehouse sometime. I will be here
Yep.
on various occasions. And I'm just going to keep finding places that I can go and take these
Great.
2-by-3 foot poster boards, and people will see them wherever they go. So
Just
that's my job.
Keep
not
wandering
theirs.
around Newburyport and you will stumble across a gem. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you, Mary.
And-
That's wonderful.
Elizabeth, how can people learn more about poetry therapy and about your work as a
Okay,
therapist?
well, there's a national association called National Association of Poetry Therapy, NAPT, and that's an organization that does a lot of training of poetry therapists, which is actually where I'm going to be trained. I haven't even started my training. I start in September.
Oh, well, that's exciting. It's nearly here.
I may sound like I'm an expert, but I'm not at all an expert yet. And so that would be the place, the NAPT, the National Association of Poetry Therapists.
And your
Therapy.
practice?
My practice is in Georgetown. I don't know how people can find me. I mean,
Do you have a website? at
I
all?
don't have a website. No.
Well, but we
I
know
have
your
a phone
name.
number.
She will.
Elizabeth Rose. And it's an easy name and a lovely
Right.
name to remember.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you both. It's really been fun and illuminating to talk to you. I've just really enjoyed talking to you and also have enjoyed your poems so much. Thank you very much.
It's been
for your
wonderful.
own-
Thank you
Thank
for
you so
having
much
us.
for understanding.
Yeah, it was
my
yeah,
pleasure.
It's very
This is another public place where people can find poetry.
Yes.
So thank you all, and thank everybody for watching or listening this morning. Please join us next week on Thursday at 9 for the morning show. Till then, take care. Find a poem.
There you go. Wonderful.
All right. Bye, everybody. Be well.